Thank you very much for that. Oh, it's a loud volume here. Thanks for that introduction, Peter. I thought that I would stand up here so that you can see me while I am speaking. I'm very happy to be here in Slovakia. I have spent now the weekend in Bratislava, visiting it for the first time with my family, and we have had a very, very nice time. It's a beautiful city, and we've tried almost all your kinds of beer. So we've enjoyed ourselves a lot. I think my only complaint against you might be the fact that Slovakia has been able to score too many goals against Sweden in ice hockey. But that's a very small complaint, so I'm very happy to be here. And I'm also, of course, very happy to have had this invitation by the MR Stefanik Conservative Institute to speak about these very important matters about economic reform. I will do a speech about this, and I hope that you will find it interesting and useful, and I also hope that we will have room for questions and discussion afterwards about any fact or argument or topic that you may find especially interesting. I shall say directly that my views are based on the principles of free economy, free individuals, and a free society. And that's not just because that's good principles, but also because, in my view, all facts say that countries founded on these principles have been able to generate more prosperity than any other kind of society. And of course, I have studied quite a lot what has taken place in Central and Eastern Europe during the last 50 years in terms of reform. And I remember 50 years ago, actually, how people believed that following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberation of these countries from communism, there would be great poverty and a huge unemployment and a dependency on foreign aid for a very, very long time. But how wrong that was. Of course there have been problems, and of course there are still problems in these countries as in all other countries, but we have seen, following the reforms, the free market reforms, and we have seen such an increase in investments, an increase in trade, an increase in economic development, which has been fantastic, tremendous effect. Flat tax, of course, not least coming from Slovakia, has been a topic of global discussion. And by the way, I would like to add that I wish those people in Parliament success tomorrow that will be fighting for tax sovereignty, which I think is very important to have tax competition in Europe and not tax harmonization. Now I know there's a new government here in Slovakia. I shall not attempt to review their program at all. I can just say that I think that every fact is speaking clearly that the reforms that were done by previous governments here have been extremely successful, and I wish this government continued success in reforms that might be in the same direction and that might improve the situation here. My topic of my book and a lot of my work is about the European social model, as it's called, which we have in Western Europe and in a way also in the Nordic countries, and I come from Sweden. So I shall dedicate this speech to the European social model and in particular to the Nordic model, because I know that many eyes in Slovakia and other countries are now turned to this so-called model, and that many think that, oh, this is the way to do it. And I will tell you why it is not, to a large extent. So if we look at Western Europe, I mean, most countries in Western Europe have been experiencing serious economic problems for a number of years, with low economic growth, high unemployment, low employment, dependency on the state, and bad welfare services. And in such times, politicians have tried to look for inspirations from other countries about what to do. But you know, most politicians know what they should do. They know it. There was one, I think, former Polish Prime Minister who said that we know what to do, we just don't know how to get re-elected afterwards. And that's, I think, the problem. And I think that if you know what to do, do it. I think there are many examples also of governments that did what they knew should be done and then were re-elected. And I think, in fact, in Slovakia, you had a government that was re-elected at least once, despite the fact that they did radical reform. But most politicians, they try to find easy ways out. They want to solve the problems without attacking the problems. And that is why they look at the Nordic countries, because it looks like, oh, these countries that can combine high taxes and still an efficient economy. And I tell you, that's completely wrong. But that's what they are looking at. But you have to ask yourself, why is there no radical reform in these countries in Western Europe if you have such big problems? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, you have a majority of the citizens dependent on the state. They get their income from the government. So, then you cannot do reforms that decrease the size of the state, that decrease the size of government, because you will take the income away from lots of people and they will vote against that. So of course that's a serious barrier to reform. Secondly, more than half of the taxes, the very, very high taxes in Western Europe and in the Nordic countries, more than half of the taxes are made invisible. You don't see that you're paying these taxes. It's the VAT, it's included in the price. You don't see that it's a tax. It's a payroll tax, it's taken away before you get your paycheck. So the taxes are made invisible, and therefore people think they pay less than they do. And then, of course, they're not so critical to the system. That's two barriers that are actually stopping reform, and I think that might explain a few things why there are no reforms and why politicians are looking for these easy ways out. But easy ways out don't work, and I will tell you why. The Nordic countries have become the answer. They seek to combine, as I said, high taxes with an efficient economy, but this is wrong. The Nordic model is a bit like a UFO, unidentified flying object. Everyone has heard about it, and most people think they know what it is, but very few know exactly the details of it, or even if it exists. And let me say first of all, there is not one Nordic model. That's false. Such a UFO does not exist. There are great differences between the Nordic countries, and the 5 Nordic countries are, of course, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway. Great differences between these countries. Second, the Nordic countries are successful in some ways, but in very, very different ways. And if you want to combine the ways in which the Nordic countries are successful, then you will have to combine the different ways in which they are successful, and not the other parts of the Nordic countries where they're unsuccessful. And third, to the extent that these countries, in their different ways, are successful, it is because they did free market reforms in these areas. And where they still have great problems, it is where they did not have free market reforms, but where they have big government socialism. So, I think it's essential to learn from the right things. I mean, you can copy the good things, but do avoid the bad things. When you look at the Nordic countries, it's essential to do that. I mean, if you look at a mathematical genius who is smoking a lot of tobacco, and you try to get to be a mathematical genius by stopping smoking, you will get bad health, but you will not be a good mathematician. So you have to copy the parts that are successful. So what should be avoided with the Nordic countries is big government with high taxes, regulations, and welfare monopolies. They create problems. But the substantial free market reforms that have been done in various fields of society could definitely be learned from. So, this is the summary, and I will get into the details so that you know that I have facts behind everything that I say. But before I do that, before I get into every single of these Nordic countries, I will tell you a few aspects about the so-called European social model, because the Nordic model is a part of that. And I will show you why the European social model is an anti-social model, and it's the reason behind many of the problems in Western Europe and not the solution. There are, of course, differences between these Western European countries, but there are also similarities, so we can speak about one European social model. First of all, the tax pressure in Western Europe is very high. It was about 20 to 25% in 1950. Then, in 1980, it was up at 45-50% as a share of the total economy, which means that it's an explosion in taxes which took place during those 3 decades. And what does the government do with the money? Well, it finances and it provides for welfare services, but also for, and by welfare services I mean education, healthcare, elderly care, but also it funds various social security systems, such as pensions, but also unemployment benefits, etc., etc. So, in various forms, the state is a very, very big share of society. And thereby, a very big share of society is run by politicians, and they have decided how to run it by collective decisions, and the space for individual decisions outside the state is limited. And the labour market is also, in Western Europe, highly regulated. That's one big part of the European social model. And as I said, this model emerged largely between 1950 and 1980. It is always said by the politicians that it was because we want to improve the welfare of people. We want to improve the social security of people. But if you look at the true history, there were some other reasons behind it. First, many politicians, also in Western Europe, in those days, believed that the centrally planned economy was a good system. It's the best way to allocate resources, the most efficient kind of economy. They believed that. They actually looked to the East, they looked to the Soviet Union, and they said, well, this might be a terrible political dictatorship, but in economic terms, it's working fine. It will probably soon outpace the United States of America. So, the centrally planned system is a good way to allocate the resources. And what did they do in Western Europe? Well, they took education, pensions, social security, healthcare, and put everything in a centrally planned system. That is, they put it under state funding and state providing. One monopoly, one centrally planned economy, and that's it. So, I think today we know that the centrally planned economy is a system which has never worked and will never be able to work for a number of reasons. Because it's a free economy with free competition that works and which leads to constant improvement. But still, in Western Europe, we have all these systems under a centrally planned economy. And that is a main reason why it is failing, this so-called social model. But that's one motivation behind it that you have to remember. Secondly, another reason, which has nothing to do with welfare, nothing to do with social security, but was one reason behind the construction of this model, is public choice. You know the Nobel laureate James Buchanan, he developed the theory of public choice as an explanation for how government is constantly growing. And you can see that in order to win elections, politicians promise people, if you elect us, you will have this and this benefit. You will have higher unemployment benefits, you will have more state schools, and you will have this and that. And after an election, they try to make reality out of at least a few of those promises. And what happens? Election by election, the state is growing, taxes are going up, and of course then you have all the special interests. You have the farmers that want their share, you have the teachers that want their share. Everyone is asking the state to give them their share. And what happens when you add them all? The state is growing as a share of society. And that is how the social model, as it's called, emerged in Western Europe. And this has nothing to do with welfare or social security, but still, that is one or two of the motivations behind it. And the core principle, of course, of this is that every important social matter should be provided by the state. And this is fundamentally different, of course, from the private society, private companies, private property, free competition, free financing, profit motive. All those things are prohibited in the state. And that is exactly why the model is failing. mentioned, I will just mention a few figures here. There are serious economic problems in Western Europe and in the Nordic countries, but I'll get back to the Nordic countries following this. You know, the Lisbon agenda. The European Union said we will be, on average, as wealthy as the Americans in the year 2010. They said that in the year 2000. And during the years that have followed since then, the gap has been bigger. The gap has widened. So we're going in the wrong direction. In fact, the average person in 38 American states is wealthier than the average person in any European country, except the banking nation of Luxembourg. The average American is 35% richer than the American. The average American is 35% richer than the average European. So that's growth. The model is creating low economic growth. Secondly, employment is much, much higher in America. Between 1970 and 2003, 59 million jobs were created in America. The increase in employment net was 59 million. That's a 75% increase. In France, Germany and Italy, the main social model European nations, it rose by 26%. So the model is stopping the growth of new jobs. But the best comparisons, I think, can be made within Europe. Denmark has an employment rate at 76%, but Poland is down at 53%. Youth unemployment is above 20% in Greece, Italy, Sweden, France, Belgium and Finland, and it's between 5 and 8% in Ireland, the Netherlands and Denmark. So, what we can say from this is that within Europe we have successful countries and also successful countries. And you can see that the more successful, the more free market reforms have been done. So growth and employment are two very important things to have a high economic growth and to have a high employment ratio to be able to improve any kind of social conditions. But unfortunately the social model is stopping the economic growth and stopping employment growth. These problems are not a coincidence. The centrally planned economy has, as I said, never worked anywhere, and it can never work. We know what kinds of cars we get from a state monopoly. Who thinks we can get good health care from a state monopoly? I usually compare the Trabant with the BMW, but I suppose that being here, the comparison of the Skoda today with the Skoda of 20 years ago. The market Skoda and the centrally planned economy Skoda is just as good an example. So this is the basic feature. This is how the European central model actually grew, and what motivations was behind it, and what very, very bad effects it has created in terms of bad economic results. When the state gets social, society does not get very social. In fact, it gets antisocial. So many politicians have realized, okay, Western Europe is totally failing. Germany, France, and Italy totally failing. So we look to Sweden, wonderful Sweden, and I'm proud of it, by the way, because I'm from Sweden and I would like people to get inspired by it. But I definitely don't want them to copy the bad parts. Let me get into the 5 Nordic countries. Are you still awake? You want to hear about the 5 Nordic countries? Okay? Good. Because I would like to tell you the truth about these countries and what to learn from it. So Sweden then, my home country, is a wonderful country. It's a country of many beautiful women, midsummer celebrations, Björn Borg, and perhaps the world's best ice hockey players. It is also the story of a free market country that went socialist and then took a few steps back into free markets again. I will focus a bit on this. Between the years 1890 and 1950, Sweden had the second highest growth rates in the world, very close to the American and the Swiss. What country was that? It was what today would be called a neoliberal, hyper-capitalist country. It had a tax pressure between 10 and 20% of the total economy. It had open borders to immigration and trade, and it had a very, very limited state, and welfare systems and social security was private. And this period explains a lot of today's wealth. If you take the 50 largest companies of Sweden today, it's only one that has been started after 1970. 49 were started in that free market Sweden that I just described. We still live off the success of those fantastic companies, Volvo and ABB and IKEA and so forth, but they're old companies. They were founded in a free market society. Then Sweden went socialist. The tax pressure more than doubled, almost tripled, up to 51%. Companies were socialized by the state. The state expanded, took over welfare services and social security that were previously private. And that had really, really bad, severe consequences for our country. If we look at the, according to the OECD, Sweden went from being the 4th richest country in the world in 1970 to number 13, just 20 years later. And we had very high inflation. We had suddenly a very high unemployment. Growth was low. And we had social problems. But that's a socialist Sweden. And then, in the 1990s, market reforms were again taking place that improved the Swedish economic performance. The telecoms market was deregulated in the beginning of the 1990s, and you all heard about the Ericsson success of mobile telephones. Marginal tax rates were cut, making it more profitable to work, and we increased the will of people to actually work. Companies were allowed to provide private healthcare, so we had competition in the healthcare sector. Healthcare was improving. The central bank was made independent. We got inflation down to roughly 2% a year. And so I think growth picked up in all the deregulated sectors. Employment developed better, and waiting lists to healthcare were shortened. But now some 10 to 15 years have passed since we did those good reforms, and the positive effects are fading away again. So we need more reforms. And big sectors in the Swedish society were left unreformed at that time. And I would say in particular the labor market. The total unemployment in Sweden is estimated to something between 15 and 20%. Total unemployment. The official rate is just 7 or 8, but many independent analyses say that in the systems of sick leave, in the systems of early retirement, in the systems of family policy, you have hidden unemployment. And if you add them all together, you have 15 to 20%. Youth unemployment is the 5th highest in the European Union at 26% right now. And the number of people under the age of 30 that have been pushed into the early retirement schemes is now over 20,000 people. It's doubled in 5 years. So we have big problems in the labor market, and we do have that because we did not reform the labor market. We have one of the highest taxes on work in all of Europe. We have real severe regulations in terms of hiring and firing. The trade unions set very high minimum wages. So we have to reform the labor market in order to solve these problems. That's where we need the next wave of free market reforms, and that would improve Sweden. We have a new government now which is starting on such reforms, and I think that's very positive. But the point again is, if you look at Sweden, you have to see that it's the free market reforms away from the social model that have been working. And where we have not done reforms is where we still have really, really serious problems. Then we go south, we come to Denmark. Denmark is the country of design, windmill power stations, and police thrillers. But as if that was not enough, the Danes are also famous for the flexicurity model, which you have probably all heard about. What's the lesson of the flexicurity model? Well, Denmark has briefly, let me say that, a similar situation to that of Sweden. First a free market country, successful, then more socialist, not successful, and then free market again, and more successful. And if you look at the labor market, it is very, very successful today. The lowest youth unemployment in the European Union, at some 6 or 7%, and one of the highest rates of employment overall. And about 1/5, that's 20% of the people in the labor market lose their jobs every year, but they all find new jobs directly. So what is this flexicurity, except an intriguing word? Well, it's flexibility and security. It's a flexible labor market with no regulations about hiring or firing. It's like America. And then you have high levels of benefits from the state to the unemployed. And third, you have active labor market policies that makes people get from unemployment and need to work again. And which parts of that, of those three parts, are important in explaining the success? Some claim that the mix is the important thing. But I think the pattern is very clear that it is the flexibility part that has been very successful, not the security part. Because countries with only the flexibility part, well, they have the same success as Denmark in the labor market. But countries with no flexibility, but only the security part, they have great problems. Just look at Sweden. So it's the flexibility part of this flexicurity model that is explaining why Denmark is actually succeeding. Then, some people say that in order to have the flexibility part, you have to give people something else. You have to give them security, because they have to accept the insecurity of the flexibility in the labor market as a political strategy. Well, I would say that I can't really see why a job-creating flexibility can't be introduced without having big government security systems providing for high unemployment benefits. I can't see that because as far as I know in Denmark, people are very happy that they can get another job if they lose their job. They don't want to live off high benefits. But even if you accept that assumption, one does not have to accept that the government should provide the security. You could have a free flexibility labor market. And then you can have security, but you can have private insurance. The state doesn't have to give you the unemployment benefits. You can buy your own private unemployment benefit if you would like the security. So if you take the flexibility from the Danish model and introduce it, you don't have to take the security part with high taxes funding high security, because if people can keep their own money, they will buy that kind of insurance if they would like it. So is that clear? Do you know what flexibility is and what parts are important? Or was it unclear? Okay. That's very good, because then we go north again. We go up to Finland. It's the country of the moving drum, 1,000 lakes, and of Nokia. But it's also the country that were involuntarily very closely tied to the Soviet Union, both in terms of the security policy and their economy. And they suffered a great loss of exports, 25%, when the Soviet Union collapsed 15 years ago. And now Finland is known for economic success. What happened in Finland? Well, during this crisis, when the exports to the Soviet Union went away, they started cutting expenditure, they privatized companies, and they limited double taxation, etc., etc. In short, they lowered taxes, they lowered the public expenditure. In fact, they cut the public expenditure as a share of the economy by more than 10 percentage points between 1993 and 2003. They shrunk the size of the state by more than 10 percentage points. It's a fantastic, radical event that took place in Finland. And as a result of these free market reforms, private wealth and corporate profits and tax revenues skyrocketed. So it was also possible to decrease income taxes from 41 to 35%. And you know, Finland today is open to globalization, it has done a pensions reform, and it's building more nuclear power. And these dramatic changes have galvanized the Finnish economy, and I think Nokia is just one great example of that. The old factory that manufactured tires is now a high-tech mobile telephony company, just as a consequence of deregulations and free market reforms. Again. Norway, going west. Norway is the beautiful country of fjords, oil, and the lusekofta. I don't know if you heard about the last part, but it's kind of a sweater, which is very warm, and that is something that's necessary in the cold country of Norway. It is one of Europe's wealthiest countries in GDP per capita, and it has a very low unemployment. But I think it's hard to analyze the reasons behind Norway's success because of the enormous oil and gas revenues. It makes it a bit of a special case. I shall not call Norway the Saudi Arabia of the Nordic, but it's a special case because of that. With such a special privilege as the oil, I think any country can have a reasonable degree of success even if you have a big socialist welfare state. And yet, even in Norway, free market ideas took place in a few years. They liberalized the financial markets, they abolished the state's TV broadcasting monopoly, and they introduced private hospitals. And when a more moderate Labour Social Democrat Party came back into power in the 1990s, they did not take away those free market reforms, which is often the case. You have a reformist government, they get out of office, Social Democrats come back, but they don't roll back the reforms, they accept them. And that's happened in Norway. And then there was a centre-right coalition coming back into power that also went further, introduced competition between private and public schools. And again, I think Norway is very hard to analyze, but I think these free market reforms, few as they were, have helped to a certain extent. And if we go even further west, northwest, to Iceland, the last of the 5 Nordic countries, to the country of geysers, volcanoes, and quite a few years of real economic success. This Arctic island is today one of the wealthiest countries in the world in GDP per capita. But until the late 1980s, the Icelandic society was deeply socialized and had many state-owned companies, high taxes, and excessive government intervention in the economy. But starting in the early 1990s, Iceland has steadily liberalized with free market reforms. Corporate taxes were cut from 45% to 18%. And income taxes from 33% to 23%. And during the same period, most state-owned companies were privatized, regulations were streamlined, and Iceland's GDP has grown on average over 4% during the last 10 years. And the purchasing power per person has grown every year since 1995, following these reforms. Unemployment in Iceland, you know what it is? It's 1.6%. So Iceland is now one of the most free market reformist countries in the last decade, and one of the most successful. They left behind a deeply centrally controlled economy, and they liberalized. And despite some economic turbulence recently, they have certainly had an enormous success following these free market reforms. So, if this journey through the 5 countries can then come to an end, I think the conclusion for me is obvious. And it is that the Nordic countries built their first success when they were free market. They had problems when they went socialist and centrally planned economy, and when they did a few free market reforms again, the situation improved. And all of this is really an empirical study in the success behind what happens when you do free market reforms. And it confirms numerous scientific studies about what free market reforms do, and also what a centrally planned economy of high taxes do. So, the lesson from the Nordic is very clear. Avoid the socialist welfare state and try to do as much free market reforms as possible. In a way, you could also say that, just make one brief comparison, because sometimes when people say, but hey, you do still have high taxes in Sweden, and you do have high economic growth. However, can you combine that? And then I sometimes have to tell them that there are many people who sit in a wheelchair that can beat me in tennis, but it's not thanks to the wheelchair that they're great. It's despite the wheelchair. They have to do other things to compensate for that, the fact that they're in a wheelchair. And they do. They exercise and they train and they can beat me in tennis, despite the fact that they have a wheelchair. And Sweden has done, we have kept the high taxes, which is a burden, like the wheelchair. But we have done many other things, pensions reform, and deregulated telecoms market, etc., to compensate for it. And we get a reasonable success in terms of growth. But if we hadn't had the high taxes, we would not only have reasonable success, we would have really good success. Last, let me say just a few words when comparing these models and countries about the future. There are some trends that all European countries, from Slovakia to Sweden, face. And I think the debate goes on in all these countries about how to tackle these challenges of the future. And I can assure you that Slovakia and Sweden face the same challenges, and that these countries will not remain as they are, no matter which government we have. First of all, we have a globalized economy, an increased globalized economy, which increases trade and investments and economic growth and prosperity all over the world, which is fantastic. It also increases competition between countries and also the specialization in the economy. And that's just the beginning. Only 20% of the Chinese and Indians have entered the global workforce. 80% remain. And we already have a big debate about the competition from them. Imagine what we will have when the rest of the 80% have joined the global workforce. Again, it's not a threat, it produces wealth, but it is something which increases competition for us. And we have to do things to be more competitive when we face that development. It puts great demands on us to be competitive, open, competent, and above all, embracing rapid change. Old jobs have to go, new jobs have to come. Old factories have to go, new factories have to come. Then you have to have a free market, flexible economy. Regardless of whether it's Slovakia, Bulgaria, or Sweden. Second, we have the demographic development. Of course, it's a great achievement of humanity that we now live longer than we did before, but systems, for instance, for pensions, that were designed for another kind of society with other age structures have to be changed. We cannot keep pensions and healthcare state-funded if the demand rises, because then taxes have to rise, and we cannot raise taxes in the globalized world because we would lose every company job that we have. So we have to introduce private ways of funding pensions, private ways of funding healthcare. And we cannot keep forcing people to stop working at a certain age, which we do now with a mandatory retirement age. We should allow people to work for as long as they like. And getting higher pensions the later they retire, thereby having an incentive to continue working. And third, among these trends of the future, is the fact that the content of our production is moving from manufacturing into services. And I think the ability of others to manufacture, such as China and India, is increasing. Studies show that the more of a country's economy that is services, the lower is unemployment and the higher is GDP per capita, which means that we have every reason to facilitate this transition from manufacturing into services economy, because that's a wealthier country, it's a country of lower unemployment. I think Ireland which is a great free market economy, has a very good example. You know that in Ireland, the employment in manufacturing since the year 2000 has decreased by 10%. But overall employment has increased by 10%. meaning that for every job lost, there were 2 new created. And often, manufacturing jobs went away, and the 2 new ones were in the services sector, and they were better paid and much better jobs overall. So we must try to make that transition easy, and it's only a free market country that can make that transition rapidly. So, to sum up, what you can learn from the Nordic countries is to avoid big states and copy the free market. And if you look at the future trends, it gets even more important to embrace the free market reforms. A free market is all about decreasing the size of the state and allowing for as much as possible to people to keep their own money and companies to expand and keep their own money, and not having regulations from the state so that smaller businesses can grow and employ people, not forcing people by mandatory retirement age to stop working. We have to have incentives to continue working. And it must, in general, that's what the free market reforms are all about. Lower taxes, smaller government, privatizations, then you will have success. And then you will have a more social society when you don't have a state that tries to be social and fails in being social. And then you do improve the conditions, the living standards of the population, you get higher incomes, you get more jobs. That's the lesson that we can learn. And that is the lesson that I would advise any country to adopt from my country and from my neighboring Nordic countries, and not copy the big state. And now I look forward to any discussion, any questions you might have. Thank you very much.